In a weathered fishing village where tradition ran as deep as the tides, a group of ruthless outlaws thought they'd found an easy mark, a 68-year-old retired sailor running a modest dockside market. They didn't know they were about to challenge a man who once commanded a billion-dollar destroyer through war-torn waters, igniting a conflict that would reshape not just their fate, but the soul of an entire coastal community. Hey there, before we dive into this incredible story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you believe in second chances and the power of community, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's video will show you another remarkable tale of courage that you won't want to miss. The salt-laden breeze carried the day's first light across Seavale Harbor as James Storm Richardson carefully arranged the fresh catch in neat rows of crushed ice. His weathered hands, marked by decades at sea, moved with the same precision that once guided the USS Valor through treacherous waters. The familiar scent of the ocean mingled with fresh fish and coffee from his small market stall, a combination that had made his spot a favorite among locals and fishing crews alike for the past decade. "Morning, Captain!" called out Katie Marshall, a local teenager who helped with the early morning unloading, her rubber boots squeaking against the worn wooden planks. "Dad says the tuna run is starting early this year." "Tell him there's always a fresh fillet waiting for your family," Storm replied, smiling as he watched her organize the day's catch. The regulars knew his market was more than just a business. It was the heart of the working harbor, where fishermen shared tales of the sea and families gathered for the freshest catch. Martha Wheeler's ancient pickup truck rumbled down the pier, right on schedule at 6:30 a.m. She'd been his first customer when he opened the market, and she hadn't missed a Monday morning in 10 years. "The usual, Storm?" she asked, already reaching for her well-worn cooler. "And maybe some of that smoked salmon Billy dropped off." "Coming right up, Martha." "How's the restaurant doing?" Storm asked, carefully selecting the finest pieces for his longtime customer. "Oh, you know how it is these days. Not as busy as it used to be, but we manage." She paused, her voice dropping slightly. "Speaking of managing, have you heard about those troublemakers down in Port Haven?" Storm's hands stilled briefly as he rapped. "A fish. Can't say that I have. What kind of trouble?" "Bad kind. They've been shaking down the smaller fishing operations, demanding protection money. Poor old Pete had to sell his boat after they sabotaged his nets. Police say they can't do much without evidence." Martha's eyes darted nervously around the quiet harbor. "Times are changing," Storm said quietly, but his voice carried the weight of command that made Martha look up from her purchase. "But some things stay the same, like the difference between respect and fear." "Just be careful, Storm," Martha warned, loading her cooler into her truck. "They call themselves the Harbor Raiders, real nasty bunch, ex-cons mostly, running some sort of smuggling operation disguised as a fishing outfit. They're not your regular rough-around-the-edges crew." Storm nodded, his mind drifting to another time when he'd faced down threats far worse than local thugs. His hand unconsciously touched the small brass compass he kept under the counter, a gift from his crew on the Valor. The tiny inscription still read, "To our captain, through storms and battles, you always find true north." The morning continued peacefully. Local fishermen stopped for coffee and to sell their catch. Tourists asked about the best seafood restaurants, and regulars shared news and gossip. Storm's market, perfectly positioned at the main pier of Seavale Harbor, had become a welcome sight for anyone working the waters. As the sun climbed higher, casting diamond-bright reflections across the harbor, Storm found himself watching a sleek black fishing boat cutting through the water toward his pier. Something about its approach seemed wrong to his experienced eye, too aggressive, too purposeful for a regular fishing vessel. He'd seen that kind of approach before, but not since his days tracking pirates off the Horn of Africa. The regulars must have sensed it too, Two elderly fishermen quickly finished their coffee and left, while a young family hurriedly packed up their purchases. By the time the black boat docked, Storm stood alone at his market, watching as 5 men in expensive fishing gear that had never seen a day's real work made their way up the pier. Their leader, a tall man with a deep scar across his jaw, approached the market with the practiced swagger of someone used to being feared. Storm noticed how the others spread out along the pier, their movements betraying military training, though not the disciplined kind. The first chapter of their story was about to unfold, but none of them knew they were about to learn a harsh lesson about the difference between those who command respect and those who demand it through fear. The morning sun painted the harbor in shades of gold and silver, catching on the weathered hulls of fishing boats and the salt-crusted ropes that lined the pier. Storm's market had been a fixture of Seavale Harbor for 10 years, ever since he'd retired from the Navy. The small wooden structure, built with his own hands, bore the same meticulous attention to detail he'd once demanded on his destroyers. Bridge, local fishermen knew to arrive early, when the catch was freshest, and Storm's coffee was just brewed. The market's location, at the heart of the working pier, made it a natural gathering spot, where seasoned captains shared weather reports and young deckhands sought advice about the trade. Storm had arranged everything with military precision. Fresh fish displayed on beds of gleaming ice, smoked delicacies hanging from cedar planks, and a small counter where he served what many claimed was the best coffee on the eastern seaboard. "You still make this coffee the same way you did on the Valor, don't you?" asked Billy Chen, a former Navy cook who now captained his own small fishing boat. He took a long sip from his thermal mug, closing his eyes in appreciation. "Some traditions are worth keeping," Storm replied, adjusting a display of fresh cod. "Speaking of traditions, how's that boy of yours doing at the academy?" Billy beamed with pride. "Top of his class in navigation. Says he wants to command a destroyer someday, just like his Uncle Storm." The morning routine had a rhythm as natural as the tides. Martha Wheeler's restaurant crew would arrive at dawn to claim the best catches for their daily specials. The tourist. Boats would start running around 9, bringing curious visitors eager to see a real working harbor. Storm knew every regular's order by heart, just as he'd once known every detail of his crew's lives. Sarah Martinez, who ran the harbor's small maritime museum, stopped by with her usual Tuesday delivery of historical photographs and artifacts. She'd been working to document the harbor's rich history, and Storm's market had become an unofficial gallery of sorts, its walls lined with black and white photographs of fishing crews and naval vessels from decades past. "Found another one of the Valor," Sarah said, carefully unwrapping a framed photograph, "from that hurricane rescue off Puerto Rico. Remember that one, Storm?" Storm nodded, studying the image of his destroyer cutting through massive waves. "Hard to forget. Saved 16 lives that night." He didn't mention the Medal of Valor that sat in a box at home, or the commendation from the president. Some achievements spoke for themselves. The regulars had settled into their usual spots, old-timers on the wooden benches out front, sharing tales that grew taller with each telling, young deckhands grabbing coffee before heading out for the day's catch. The smell of the sea mingled with fresh fish and hot coffee, creating an atmosphere as comfortable as a well-worn captain's chair. "Storm," called out Mike Patterson, one of the harbor's oldest fishermen. "Remember when this pier was just a few planks and some rope? Look at it now. Best market in 3 states, thanks to you." Storm smiled, remembering the day he'd first seen the dilapidated pier. After 30 years in the Navy, he could have retired anywhere, but something about Seavale's quiet strength had called to him. The harbor had been struggling then, with fewer boats each season and young people leaving for bigger ports. But Storm had seen its potential, just as he'd once seen potential in young sailors others had written off. Katie Marshall rushed up to the market, her usual energy subdued. "Captain," she said quietly, "Dad wanted me to warn you. There's word that the harbor raiders are moving up the coast. They were in Port Haven yesterday and, she glanced around nervously, they're not just asking for protection money anymore. They're forcing boats to carry cargo, the kind nobody asks questions about. Storm's expression remained calm, but his mind was already analyzing the situation with tactical precision. He'd seen operations like this before, during his anti-piracy patrols. Criminals using legitimate fishing operations as cover for drug, running, or human trafficking. "Tell your father to be careful," Storm said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once guided hundreds of sailors through combat. "And Katie, stay close to shore for a few days. Sometimes the weather turns." Without warning, the young girl nodded, understanding the real meaning behind his words. As she hurried off, Storm noticed other changes in the harbor's rhythm. Boats were returning earlier than usual, crews keeping closer together. The usual banter had a nervous edge, and more than one captain cast wary glances toward the harbor entrance. But Storm Richardson hadn't earned his nickname by running from storms, whether they came from nature or human malice. He'd faced down typhoons and enemy vessels, pirates and hurricanes. His hand touched the compass under the counter, feeling its familiar weight. The harbor was his home now, its people his new crew. And just as he'd protected his sailors on the Valor, he would protect them here. The morning light caught on something out in the bay, a flash of black hull against the sparkling water. Storm watched through eyes trained by decades at sea, recognizing the deliberate movement of predators, approaching their prey. But these waters already had a guardian, even if those approaching didn't know it yet. Storm Richardson's past was written in the quiet confidence of his movements, each gesture shaped by decades of naval command. The locals who frequented his market knew pieces of his story. 30 years in the Navy, command of the USS Valor, missions that had earned him a chest full of medals he never discussed. But few knew the full measure of the man who now spent his days weighing fish and brewing coffee. The compass he kept under the counter told more of his story than he ever did. A brass masterpiece from the 1800s, it had been mounted in a handcrafted wooden case by his crew. The inscription spoke volumes. "To our captain, through storms and battles, you always find true north." They'd presented it to him after a particularly harrowing mission off the Somalia coast, where his decisive leadership had saved not just his ship, but 3 civilian vessels from pirates. "Captain," a familiar voice called out, interrupting his thoughts. Commander Marcus Chen, retired Navy, intelligence, and now harbor master, approached the market with purpose in his stride. "Got a moment?" Storm gestured to the small office behind the market counter where he kept his books and weather charts. The space was small but organized with military precision, maritime maps covering one wall and a detailed harbor chart on another. A single photograph hung beside his desk, the USS Valor cutting through heavy seas, her bow rising against a storm-dark sky. "What's on your mind, Marcus?" Storm asked, though he suspected he knew. Marcus had been tracking the harbor raiders' movements for months, feeding information to the Coast Guard when he could. "They're getting bolder," Marcus said, his voice low. "What they did in Port Haven, it wasn't just intimidation. They're using the local boats for smuggling runs, forcing crews to move product up from the Caribbean. Anyone who refuses—" He let the sentence hang. Storm nodded, remembering similar operations he'd encountered during his command. "They're building a network, using legitimate businesses as cover. Coast Guard's spread thin," Marcus continued. "Local police are out of their depth. And now we're hearing whispers they've got someone inside the Port Authority, someone high up enough to ensure certain boats don't get inspected." The implications were clear. Seavale Harbor, with its strategic location and tight-knit fishing, Community would be a perfect hub for their operations. Storm thought of Katie Marshall and her father, of Billy Chen's son at the academy, of all the families who depended on these waters for their livelihood. I didn't spend 30 years defending these waters to watch them fall to thugs with fast boats, Storm said quietly, but with steel in his voice. Marcus recognized the tone. It was the same one that had guided them through typhoons and firefights. You've got friends, Storm. The old network's still out there. One call. Storm held up a hand. Not yet. Let's see their play first. Sometimes the best defense is letting your opponent show their hand. As if on cue, Billy Chen burst into the office, his face flushed. Storm there at the fuel dock, 3 of them throwing their weight around, telling Pete he needs to register his boat with them for protection. Pete's kid is with him. Storm moved with the fluid efficiency that had once made him legendary on the bridge. In the market, he quickly directed Katie to call her father, then turned to the gathered fishermen. Nobody plays hero. These waters are our home, but sometimes you have to weather a storm before you can fight it. The morning light caught on his compass as he tucked it into his pocket, a habit from his commanding days when decisions could mean life or death. He'd earned his nickname during a typhoon off the Philippines, holding his course through waves that would have swallowed smaller vessels. His crew had started calling him Storm after that night, saying he was more relentless than any weather they'd faced. Through the office window, he could see the black boat that had entered the harbor earlier, its crew moving with the practiced arrogance of men used to taking what they wanted. Their leader's stance, the way he positioned his men. Storm recognized military training gone wrong, probably special operations who'd chosen the wrong path after discharge. Like looking in a dark mirror, Marcus muttered, following his gaze. They've got the training, but none of the honor. Storm watched as the harbor's usual morning bustle quieted, fishermen and workers drawing back, creating a bubble of tension around the fuel dock. He'd seen this before, good people stepping back from trouble, hoping it would pass them by. But some troubles, like some storms, had to be faced head-on. Time to introduce ourselves, Storm said, straightening his weathered jacket. Marcus, remember that operation off Yemen, when we let the pirates think they had us surrounded? A slow smile spread across Marcus's face. Sometimes the best trap is the one your enemy walks into willingly. The morning sun had burned away the last of the harbor mist, revealing a scene about to change in ways none of them could fully predict. Storm Richardson had spent his life reading waters both calm and troubled. Now, watching the harbor raiders throw their weight around his pier, he recognized another storm gathering. But this time, he wasn't just protecting a ship and crew. He was protecting a community, a way of life, and the very soul of Seavale Harbor. The early warning signs rippled through Seavale Harbor like waves before a storm. The morning's usual bustle had taken on an uneasy rhythm, with fishermen speaking in hushed tones and boats clustering closer together at their moorings. Word had spread quickly about the harbor raiders' brutality in Port Haven, and now their shadow loomed over Seavale's peaceful waters. 3 boats hit last week, whispered Carl Martinez to Storm as he unloaded his morning catch. They're not just breaking equipment anymore. Mike's boy got roughed up pretty bad when he tried to stop them from planting something in their hold. Nobody's saying what it was, but Storm nodded grimly, understanding the unspoken implications. His years tracking smugglers had taught him their patterns, how they'd establish dominance in stages, starting with intimidation before escalating to forced cooperation. He'd seen similar operations in the Gulf of Aden, where fishing vessels became unwilling mules for everything from drugs to weapons. Marcus Chen had spent the morning making discreet calls from the harbour master's office, his conversations painting a disturbing picture. The raiders weren't just thugs with boats. They were organized, methodical, and had connections reaching into local law enforcement. Their leader, a man known only as the Admiral, had a reputation for military precision. In his operations, got some intel from my old contacts, Marcus reported during a quiet moment at Storm's Market. Your instincts were right. Their leader, he's former Navy too, Commander James Shark Harrison, served in special operations before something went wrong during a mission. Details are classified, but he was discharged under suspicious circumstances. Storm's expression darkened. He remembered Harrison, a promising officer who'd let ambition override honor. There had been rumors about missing funds, civilian casualties, operations that crossed lines better left uncrossed. The Admiral was a mockery of everything the title should represent. Katie Marshall's father, Dan, pulled his boat in earlier than usual, his face tight with concern. They followed us this morning, he told Storm, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Black boat, staying just at the edge of visibility. Didn't do anything, just watched, like they were studying our routine. Throughout the day, more signs accumulated. A Coast Guard patrol boat passed unusually close to the harbor, its crew making a show of routine inspection, but clearly concerned about something larger. Two unfamiliar boats anchored just outside the harbor entrance, their crews too well dressed for ordinary fishing work. Sarah Martinez stopped by the market again, but this time she wasn't carrying historical photographs. They were asking questions at the museum, she said quietly, about the harbor layout, old smuggling routes from Prohibition days. They said they were writing a book, but their interest seemed specific. Storm found himself watching the water more carefully, his old tactical instincts rising to the surface. He noted how the strange boats were positioned, perfect for monitoring all harbor traffic. Their radio chatter, picked up by his small receiver, was too organized for ordinary fishermen, using patterns that suggested military background. Billy. Chen voiced what many were thinking during the afternoon lull. They're mapping us out, aren't they? Learning our patterns, our weaknesses, just like you taught us to do in the Navy before an operation. Knowledge is power, Storm replied, his voice carrying the weight of experience. But it works both ways. Everything they learn about us, we learn about them. Sometimes showing your opponent what they expect to see is the best way to mask your true strength. The tension peaked when Pete's young son Tommy came running down the pier, out of breath and wide-eyed. Mr. Richardson, they're asking about, you know, at the bar, offering money for information about your schedule, who visits the market, everything. Storm exchanged glances with Marcus. The raiders were being thorough, professional. Exactly what made them so dangerous. They weren't just criminals. They were trained operators applying military tactics to criminal enterprise. As the afternoon wore on, the harbor's usual friendly atmosphere had transformed into something more reminiscent of Storm's combat deployments. Quiet alertness, coded conversations, subtle signals passing between boats. The fishermen, many of them veterans themselves, recognized the signs of impending conflict. Martha Wheeler made an unexpected second visit to the market, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced with genuine fear. My boy overheard them at the restaurant, she said, her voice trembling. They're not just passing through Storm, they're planning to make Seavale their new base of operations. Said something about this harbor being perfect for their needs. Storm stood at his market counter, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. The raiders were playing a calculated game, but they'd made one critical mistake. They assumed Seavale Harbor was defenseless, just another small port they could bend to their will. They didn't realize they were sailing into waters already protected by someone who'd spent a lifetime studying the art of naval warfare. The compass in his pocket seemed to grow heavier, reminding him of other battles, other storms weathered. The harbor raiders were about to learn that some ports came with guardians they couldn't intimidate, and some storms hit back harder than any criminal enterprise could handle. The deep rumble of diesel engines shattered the morning calm as three black boats cut through Seavale's Harbor entrance. Their hulls, unmarked and freshly painted, moved with military precision towards Storm's market. The few fishermen preparing for the day's work quickly retreated to their vessels, leaving the pier eerily empty. Storm watched from behind his counter as 6 men disembarked, their movements betraying professional training. Their leader, tall and scarred, wore expensive fishing gear that had never seen real use. Storm recognized him immediately, Commander James "Shark" Harrison, though he now called himself the Admiral. "Nice operation you've got here, old man," Harrison called out, his voice carrying the false warmth of a predator toying with prey. "Quite the setup. Fresh fish, good coffee, perfect location." He glanced around the empty pier. "Shame if anything happened to it." "Fish is $15 a pound," Storm replied calmly, continuing to arrange his display. "Veterans get a discount." Harrison's laugh echoed across the water, hollow and threatening. "Still playing by the rules, Storm? Always the perfect officer." "I did my homework. USS Valor, 30 years of distinguished service, more medals than you can count. But this isn't the Navy anymore, Captain. These waters have new management." Storm studied the man before him, noting how the other raiders spread out along the pier in tactical positions. Their stance, their spacing, everything screamed special operations training gone wrong. "The only management these waters need is the harbor master and Coast Guard," Storm replied evenly. Harrison's face darkened. One of his men knocked over a display of fresh cod, while another ran his hand through a box of live lobsters, deliberately scattering them across the deck. "Let me be clear," Harrison growled, leaning over the counter. "Every boat in this harbor's going to start carrying our special cargo. Every business is going to pay for our protection. Starting with you. $2,000 a week or accidents start happening. Lots of dangerous currents in these waters." Storm set down his cleaning cloth and met Harrison's gaze. The younger man flinched involuntarily, recognizing something in the veteran's eyes, the kind of strength that comes not from causing fear, but from facing it. "Let me be equally clear," Storm replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded hundreds through combat. "This market opens every morning to serve this community. It's been here 10 years, and it'll be here tomorrow. Now either buy some fish or move along." Harrison grabbed a premium tuna steak and crushed it in his fist, red juices dripping between his fingers. "Wrong answer, old man. Maybe we'll start with that vintage compass you keep under the counter, the one your crew gave you after Somalia. Be a shame if it ended up at the bottom of the harbor." As the raiders moved back to their boats, Harrison turned for one final threat. "We'll be back tonight, and you're going to learn how things work in my waters now. Maybe we'll start with those nice historical photos your friend Sarah keeps bringing by." Storm waited until their boats disappeared around the harbor mouth before reaching for his phone. His weathered fingers found a number he hadn't called in years. It belonged to the Maritime Veterans Association, an organization of former naval officers who had served in various conflicts. Storm had helped their founder during a particularly rough time after Desert Storm, and they'd given him their card with a simple message: "The sea never forgets its own." He glanced at the crushed tuna on his counter, remembering something his XO used to say during their anti-piracy patrols. "Sometimes the biggest mistake a pirate can make is attacking the wrong ship." The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Operations, Captain Rodriguez speaking. Miguel, this is James Richardson. USS Valor, 85 to 15, about that favor you've been wanting to repay." The harbor raiders were about to learn a harsh lesson about the difference between ruling waters and protecting them. Rodriguez's voice softened with recognition. "Storm. Richardson? The Storm Richardson from the Somali coast? Brother, I've been waiting 10 years for this call." "Never thought I'd need to make it, Miguel. But times change, and some people need reminding about the true meaning of naval tradition." Storm detailed the morning's events, his voice steady as he described the harbor raiders' threats. On the other end of the line, Rodriguez listened silently, though Storm could hear his breathing grow heavier with each detail. They threatened. "Your compass, your crew's gift." Rodriguez's voice had turned to steel. "You're on Seavale's main pier, right?" "That's right. Give me 3 hours. And Storm, stay put. The fleet's coming home." The rest of the morning passed with an unusual tension. Hanging over Seavale Harbor, regular customers noticed Storm's changed demeanor, though his hands remained steady as ever while weighing fish and pouring coffee. Sarah arrived around 10 with more historical photographs, immediately sensing something was wrong when she saw the scattered display and crushed tuna. "Dad," she said, noticing his tight expression, "what happened here?" "Just some disagreement with new customers," Storm replied, not wanting to worry her. "How's the Maritime Museum project coming along?" "Dad." Sarah's tone matched his own command. Voice from years ago. "I know that look. It's the same one you had during the hurricane evacuation last year. What's really going on?" Before Storm could answer, the distant rumble of boat engines echoed across the water again. Sarah tensed, but Storm placed a calming hand on her shoulder. "It's all right," he said, a slight smile crossing his face. "Those aren't the same boats from this morning." 3 vessels appeared around the harbor entrance, moving with military precision. The lead boat, a pristine former Coast Guard cutter, pulled up directly in front of the market. Its captain, a tall woman with silver hair tied back in a tight braid, disembarked with practiced ease. The patch on her weathered jacket read, "Iron Lady, Desert Storm Veteran, Captain Maria Rodriguez." "Permission to come aboard," she announced, approaching the market and rendering a crisp salute. "Miguel sent us ahead to assess the situation. Rest of the fleet's about an hour out." Storm returned the salute. "At ease, Captain. Coffee?" "Wouldn't miss it. Miguel says your brew got him through some rough nights after Kuwait." She turned to Sarah. "You must be Storm's daughter. Your father saved Miguel's life back in '91. Never talks about anything else at our meetings." "Meetings?" Sarah looked between them. "Dad, what's going on?" Iron Lady smiled, but there was steel behind it. "We're the Maritime Veterans Association. Your father's been a silent member since he helped found it. Today, we're returning the favor." The other 2 vessels had taken up positions at either end of the pier, their movements casual but purposeful. Both crews wore similar jackets with naval patches and campaign ribbons. "Mike, take a ride down to Port Haven," Iron Lady called out. "Check on Pete's operation. Jack, head up to the point. I want to know when our guests return." Sarah grabbed her father's arm. "What guests, Dad? You're scaring me." "Some local troublemakers. Think they can extort protection money from businesses along the harbor?" Storm explained, his voice gentle but firm. "They stopped by this morning to make their pitch. Weren't too happy with my response." "The harbor raiders." Sarah's face paled. "Dad, they're dangerous. They destroyed Pete's equipment. They've been terrorizing harbors all up the coast." Iron Lady laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "Dangerous, ma'am. Your father faced down Somali pirates with nothing but a damaged engine and sheer determination. These wannabe tough guys? They're about to learn what real dangerous looks like." The radio on Iron Lady's belt crackled. "Captain, we've got incoming. Looks like our friends couldn't wait until tonight. Count 3 boats moving fast. Right on schedule," Iron Lady smiled. "Storm, you got somewhere safe for your daughter?" "I'm not leaving," Sarah protested. "This is my father's market, our market." Storm looked at his daughter, seeing the same determination that her mother had shown during their years at sea. "She stays," he told Iron Lady. "Richardsons don't run." The rumble of approaching boats grew louder. Iron Lady spoke quietly into her radio, then turned to Storm. "Main force is 20 minutes out. Think we can keep them talking that long?" "Won't need to," Storm replied, reaching under the counter again. This time he pulled out an old photograph, worn at the edges but carefully preserved. Sometimes the best weapon isn't a gun, it's the truth. The harbor raiders roared into the marina, their boats forming a loose semicircle around Storm's market. Harrison dismounted first, his face twisted with anger when he spotted the veteran vessels. "Brought some friends, old man?" he sneered. "Won't help. These waters are still our territory." "Territory?" Iron Lady stepped forward, her voice carrying across the pier. "Son, the only territory here was paid for by the blood of better sailors than you'll ever be." Harrison's hand moved toward his jacket, but Iron Lady's voice stopped. "Him cold. I wouldn't. Two of the finest marksmen I ever commanded are watching you right now. Desert Storm taught them patience. Somalia taught them precision." "You're bluffing," Harrison snarled, but his hand moved away from his jacket. Storm picked up the photograph from the counter. "Before we continue this discussion, I think you should look at something, James." Harrison's face went white. "How do you know my name?" "Because," Storm held out the photograph, "I served with your father on the USS Constitution. David Harrison, best navigation officer in the whole damn fleet. Saved our ship 3 times during the Gulf War. His last words were about you, asked me to make sure his son understood what real leadership looks like." The pier went completely silent. Harrison stared at the photograph, his hands shaking as he recognized his father's young face among the officers. "You're lying," he whispered, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Your father had a gold pocket watch," Storm continued, "engraved with your birth date. Carried it through every patrol. Said it gave him strength knowing he had a son to go home to." Harrison reached into his jacket with trembling hands, pulling out a tarnished gold watch. The date matched exactly. "How did he—" His voice cracked. "How did he die?" "Protecting our evacuation from the Gulf. Stayed at his post until the end, making sure every civilian vessel made it to safety. Real strength, James, not this act you've been putting on." The sound of engines filled the air again, but this time it was different. Dozens of boats appeared from both directions, their crews, wearing jackets covered in naval patches and campaign ribbons. The Maritime Veterans Association had arrived in force, but looking at Harrison's face, Storm knew the real battle was already won. Sometimes the strongest weapon against hate isn't force. It's the truth about who we really are and who we're meant to be. James Harrison, known to his gang as the Admiral, stood frozen, the gold watch trembling in his hands as more veteran vessels moved into the harbor. The contrast was striking. On one side, the harbor raiders, their tough guy facades cracking. On the other, real sailors who had nothing to prove. "Your father carried that watch through 3 deployments," Storm continued, his voice gentle but firm. "When things got rough, he'd look at that date and tell us stories about his little boy back home, about how he wanted you to grow up, understanding what honor really means." Captain Rodriguez's massive cutter pulled up to the front of the group. The MVA founder dismounted, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile as he approached Storm. They embraced like brothers, then Miguel turned to face Harrison. "Your dad was the reason I made it home," Miguel said. "When my ship was hit, navigation systems down, David guided us through enemy waters to safety. Never met a braver officer." Harrison's crew members shifted uncomfortably, looking between their leader and the growing circle of veterans. One of them, a younger man with a fresh Coast Guard tattoo on his arm, nervously revved his engine. "Shut it down, kid," Iron Lady commanded. "Show some respect. You're floating on hallowed waters." Now, Storm walked around his counter, the photograph still in his hand. "Your father died protecting others, James. These men here, Miguel, me, dozens more, we're alive because of him. Is this how you honor his sacrifice? By terrorizing small harbors, threatening old sailors?" I didn't know," Harrison whispered, his tough guy persona crumbling completely. Leaving behind what Storm saw was really just a lost son. "After Mum died, I found the watch in her things. Never knew the story behind it." "Your mother was a strong woman," Storm nodded. Elizabeth. Harrison. She used to send care packages to the whole crew, called us her other sons. Tears began streaming down Harrison's face. The remaining facade of the Admiral washed away with them. His crew members looked increasingly uncertain, their formation breaking down as more veteran boats arrived. Iron Lady stepped forward, her voice carrying across the harbor. Today's not about revenge, boys. It's about remembrance and honor, about understanding the difference between acting tough and being strong. The young man with the Coast Guard tattoo suddenly cut his engine. "I'm out, boss," he announced. "My grandfather was a Navy Cross recipient. He'd roll over in his grave if he knew what we've been doing." He looked at the gathered veterans. "I'm sorry, all of you. This isn't what I signed up for." One by one, other raiders began backing away, their manufactured toughness melting under the gaze of real sailors. But Storm kept his eyes on Harrison, who was still staring at the photograph of his father. "He smiled, just like you," Storm said softly. "Same laugh, too. Every time he got a letter from your mom with news about you, his whole face would light up. Proud father, prouder sailor." Miguel moved closer, his voice gentle. "We've got a veterans hall down in Port Haven. Sailors meet there twice a week, share stories, help each other out. Your father's picture's on our wall of heroes. Maybe it's time you came to hear some stories about him, learn who he really was." Sarah, who'd been watching silently, emerged from behind the counter with a fresh cup of coffee. She held it out to Harrison. "On the house," she said. "Dad always says coffee tastes better when shared with family." Harrison took the cup with shaking hands. "Pete's equipment," he said suddenly. "What we destroyed, we need to make that right." "Yes, you do," Iron Lady agreed. "But that's a good start. Recognizing our mistakes, fixing what we've broken, that's real strength." The young man with the Coast Guard tattoo stepped forward. "I've got experience with marine electronics. Used to work maintenance before all this. I could help rebuild." Miguel smiled. "MVA's got a community service program, helps veterans and their families. Think Pete could use some volunteers." More raiders began nodding, the tough guy act replaced by something more genuine, shame, but also hope. The transformation was happening right before their eyes. "Your father believed in second chances," Storm told Harrison. "Said everyone deserves. One good shot at redemption. Question is, what are you going to do with yours?" Harrison finally looked up from the photograph, his eyes clear for the first time. Can you tell me more about him, about what he was really like?" "Better than that," Storm replied. "See all these men and women here? Each one has a story about David Harrison, about his courage, his loyalty, his love for his family." Storm gestured to the market. "Pull up a chair, son. Coffee's hot and stories are free." The tension in the harbor had completely transformed. Where there had been threat and intimidation, now there was something different: understanding, respect, and maybe even the beginnings of healing. Iron Lady began organizing the veterans, sending some to check on other harbors the raiders had terrorized, others to start planning Pete's equipment restoration. The remaining raiders, stripped of their false bravado, found themselves surrounded by men and women who had faced real battles and emerged stronger for it. Harrison, still clutching his father's watch, sat at Storm's counter, absorbing every word about David Harrison's service. "Your father once told me," Storm said, as Harrison listened intently, "that true strength isn't about making others fear you. It's about being someone others can count on, about standing up for what's right even when it's hard." Sarah brought out more coffee and fresh fish sandwiches. The veterans gathered around, some sitting on their boats, others standing in small groups, all ready to share stories of a fallen brother with his lost son. The morning sun had fully burned away the harbor mist, revealing a scene no one could have predicted just hours earlier. Where violence had threatened to erupt, reconciliation was taking root instead. The market, as it had for 10 years, continued serving as a gathering place for the community. Only now, that community was growing in unexpected ways. The young raider, with the Coast Guard tattoo, who'd introduced himself as Tommy, spoke up hesitantly. "Mr. Richardson, about Pete's equipment. I was the one who sabotaged his navigation system. I want to fix it, not just because I have to, but because I need to." Iron Lady, who had been coordinating with other veterans on her radio, turned to Tommy. "What's your background, son? Besides vandalism?" Tommy flushed red. 4 years Coast Guard electronics tech, Mom. Specialized in marine navigation systems. The irony's not lost on me. "Good skills," she nodded. "We could use that. Pete's boat needs more than just basic repairs. MVA is organizing a complete overhaul. Want to lead that project?" Tommy's eyes widened. "Me? But I'm one of the ones who—" "Redemption isn't just about saying sorry," Miguel interrupted. "It's about actions, using your skills to build instead of destroy. That's real strength." Harrison looked up from another photograph Storm had shared. "The whole crew will help. It's not negotiable," he added, looking at his remaining members. None disagreed. Sarah, who had been making calls of her own, hung up her phone with a smile. "Just talk to Pete. He's willing to give you boys a chance to make it right. Says if you're serious about changing, he might even have some work available." "That's more than we deserve," Harrison said quietly. "Deserve's got nothing to do with it," Storm replied. "Your father taught me that after I got hit bad in 91. Felt sorry for myself. Thought I deserved to go down with my ship. David sat with me all night, talking about forgiveness, about how life gives us chances to rebuild, not because we deserve them, but because that's how we grow." The transformation in the harbor was remarkable. Where hours ago there had been tension and threat of violence, now there was purpose and planning. The former raiders were trading their tough guy personas for something more authentic, a chance to be part of something bigger than themselves, something honorable. Storm watched as Harrison absorbed another story about his father, seeing the gradual change in the younger man's face. The shadows of anger and loss were still there, but something else was emerging. Pride, understanding, and perhaps a glimmer of the man David Harrison had always hoped his son would become. The harbor waters reflected the morning sun, calm now, as if they too sensed the shift in the air. What had started as a confrontation was transforming into something none of them could have predicted. A story of redemption, of fathers and sons, of lost souls finding their way back to honor. As the story continued to unfold, the transformation went far beyond just the harbor. Pete's damaged equipment became a symbol of redemption as Tommy led the restoration efforts, applying his Coast Guard training to not just repair but upgrade the systems. Other raiders, rediscovering their own skills and training, joined in with renewed purpose. "See this navigation array?" Tommy explained to Pete, pointing out the improvements. "We're installing a backup system, military grade, better than what you had before. And here," he gestured to a new radar display, "early warning, system for rough weather." Harrison, who had spent hours listening to stories about his father, found himself drawn to the Veterans Hall in Port Haven. The photographs on the Wall of Heroes told stories of courage and sacrifice, none more powerful than the image of David. Harrison at his navigation station during the Gulf War. "Your father saved 16 vessels that night," Miguel told him, pointing to the photograph. "Civilian ships caught in the crossfire. He plotted a course through enemy waters, stayed at his post even when we took fire. The MVA's community service program expanded rapidly, with former raiders working alongside veterans to restore other damaged boats and equipment up and down the coast. What began as restitution evolved into something more meaningful, a way to honor the maritime traditions they had once corrupted." Storm's Market remained the heart of this transformation. Each morning, coffee and conversation flowed as freely as the tide, with veterans sharing stories and former raiders finding their way back to the values they'd abandoned. Sarah started a mentorship program, pairing experienced sailors with young crew members who wanted to learn the right way to work the waters. "It's like your father always said," Storm told Harrison one morning, watching Tommy teach a group of local kids about marine electronics. "The sea doesn't care about your past. It only cares about who you are today, right now, in this moment." The harbor itself seemed to reflect the change. Boats that had once hurried past now lingered, their crews knowing they'd find not just fresh fish and good coffee, but a community built on mutual respect and understanding. The raiders' black boats were repainted in Coast Guard colors, their new purpose symbolized by the fresh paint and proud crews. Iron Lady's prediction proved true. Their story spread to other harbors, where similar transformations began to take root. The Maritime Veterans Association established a formal rehabilitation program, helping other veterans who had lost their way find their way back to honor. Harrison kept his father's watch close, but now it represented not just memories of the past, but promises for the future. He worked with Miguel to establish a scholarship fund in his father's name, helping children of fallen sailors pursue maritime careers. "He would have loved this," Harrison said softly one evening, watching the sunset paint the harbor in gold. "Not just the changes we're making, but seeing everyone come together like this." Storm nodded, understanding that some transformations run deeper than the eye can see. The compass his crew had given him sat proudly on the market counter now, its inscription visible to all, a reminder that finding true north sometimes means helping others find their way home. The harbor's rhythm had changed, becoming something stronger, more purposeful. Where fear had once ruled, respect now guided every interaction. The raiders' legacy was being rewritten, not through intimidation, but through service, honor, and the kind of strength that builds rather than destroys. As autumn approached, bringing with it the promise of challenging seas ahead, Seavale Harbor stood as a testament to the power of redemption. Storm's Market, once targeted by those who mistook fear for strength, had become a beacon of hope for others seeking their way back from darkness to light. The transformation of Seavale Harbor culminated in a community celebration that marked a new chapter for everyone involved. Families gathered at the newly restored pier, children's laughter mixing with the sound of gentle waves. Storm's Market served as the centerpiece, its expanded space now featuring a small museum corner dedicated to the harbor's history. Harrison arrived early, helping arrange chairs for the ceremony. His father's watch gleamed in the morning sun as he directed former raiders, now dressed in Coast Guard auxiliary uniforms, to their positions. Tommy stood proudly beside his completed work, Pete's boat, now equipped with state-of-the-art navigation, systems that surpassed its original specifications. "Your father would be proud," Iron Lady said, approaching Harrison quietly. "Not just of the changes you've made, but of the leader you're becoming." The celebration began with Storm taking the stage, his weathered hands gripping the podium with the same steady confidence that had once guided ships through combat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying across the water, "what you see here today isn't just about restoration of equipment or buildings. It's about the restoration of something more precious: honor, community, and the understanding that true strength lies not in creating fear, but in fostering respect." He paused, glancing at Harrison, Tommy, and the other former raiders, now standing tall among the gathered veterans. This started as a confrontation, but it became something more, a reminder that redemption is always possible when we choose to honor the best in ourselves. The Maritime Veterans Association had turned out in force, their vessels lining the harbor in a display of unity. Miguel presented Harrison with a framed photograph of his father, recently discovered in naval archives. "Your father's legacy lives on," he said, "not just in these waters, but in the choices you're making now." As the speeches continued, the impact of their transformation became clear. Representatives from neighboring harbors spoke about similar programs starting in their communities. The Coast Guard announced a new partnership with the MVA, creating pathways for troubled veterans to find their way back to service. Sarah unveiled the market's new Veterans Wall, where David Harrison's photograph hung alongside other fallen heroes. Below it, a brass plaque read, "In honor of those who taught us that true strength lies in lifting others up, not tearing them down." The highlight came when Harrison took the stage, his voice steady despite the emotion visible on his face. "A few months ago I thought strength meant making others fear you," he said, holding up his father's watch. "I was wrong. Real strength, as my father knew, is about protection, not domination. About building community, not destroying it." As evening approached, the celebration transformed into something more intimate. Veterans and former raiders shared meals and stories, their past antagonism replaced by mutual respect. Storm's market, illuminated by strings of lights, hummed with conversation and laughter. "You know what your father's last words to me were?" Storm asked Harrison quietly as they watched the sun set over the harbor. He said, "Sometimes the strongest waves are the ones that lift all boats." Took me years to truly understand what he meant. Harrison nodded, understanding flowing deeper than words. The harbor had become more than just a place of business. It was a testament to the power of redemption, a reminder that even the stormiest waters could calm with the right guidance. As darkness fell, the lights reflected off the gentle waves, creating a tableau of peace that seemed impossible just months before. The harbor had changed, but more importantly, its people had changed. What started as a confrontation between an old sailor and those who would rule through fear had become a story of transformation, of fathers and sons, of lost souls finding their way home. Storm's compass sat proudly on his counter, its inscription, "Catching the light. Through storms and battles, you always find true north." It had guided him through physical storms at sea, but now it served as a beacon for something greater, the journey from darkness to light, from fear to respect, from destruction to creation. The harbor would face other challenges, other storms, but its people now understood something profound, that true strength lies not in the power to destroy, but in the courage to rebuild, to forgive, and to transform. As the stars emerged above Seavale Harbor, they illuminated not just a community restored, but a legacy renewed, a promise kept, and a future bright with possibility. As the celebration wound down, Storm and Harrison stood at the market counter, sharing one last cup of coffee. The harbor lights danced on the water, casting a gentle glow that seemed to embody the peace they'd found. "I keep thinking about redemption," Harrison said, studying his father's watch. "How it's not just about fixing what's broken, but building something new." Storm nodded, reaching for his compass. "Your father understood that. Every navigation challenge was a chance to plot a better course." The transformation had rippled far beyond Seavale. News spread along the coast of the harbor raiders' reformation. Other troubled veterans, hearing the story, began finding their way to the MVA's program. The black boats that once inspired fear now led rescue missions and training exercises. Tommy had become the lead instructor for the harbor's new maritime electronics school, teaching young sailors the skills he'd once used for destruction. "Every system we repair," he told his students, "is another step toward making these waters safer for everyone." The market expanded its role as a community hub. Storm and Sarah established a scholarship fund, helping young people pursue maritime careers. The Veterans Wall became a place of pilgrimage, where sailors shared stories of honor and service. Iron Lady's prediction proved prophetic. The MVA's rehabilitation program spread to other ports, each success story adding to the legacy of transformation. Harrison led many of these efforts, using his experience to reach others who had lost their way. Sometimes, Storm told a group of visiting sailors, the greatest victories aren't won through force, but through understanding, through remembering who we are and who we're meant to be. Pete's boat, now a training vessel for aspiring mechanics, became a symbol of renewal. The advanced systems Tommy installed helped establish new safety standards for the entire coast. What began as restitution evolved into innovation. The harbor itself seemed to embrace its new identity. The waters that once harbored fear now cradled hope. Each sunrise brought new possibilities, new chances for redemption. Sarah expanded the market's historical collection, adding photographs of the transformation alongside the older images. It's important to remember both parts of the story, she explained, where we were and how far we've come. As winter approached, bringing with it the challenge of rough seas, Seavale Harbor stood ready. The community had learned that strength flows not from individual power, but from collective purpose. Storm's compass remained on display, its inscription a daily reminder of the truths they'd discovered. True north wasn't just a direction, it was a calling, a commitment to navigate by the stars of honor rather than the false lights of fear. The story of Seavale Harbor became more than just a tale of confrontation and redemption. It became a beacon for others, lost in their own storms, proof that even in the darkest waters, there's always a path home to honor, community, and purpose. As Storm locked up the market that final evening of the celebration, he gazed out at the peaceful harbor. The waters reflected not just the stars above, but the light of transformation, a reminder that sometimes the greatest changes come not from defeating an enemy, but from helping a lost soul find their way back to shore. The legacy of Seavale Harbor's transformation lived on through the seasons. The Maritime Veterans Association's rehabilitation program expanded to ports across the country, with Harrison and Tommy frequently traveling to share their story of redemption. Their black boats, once symbols of intimidation, were now painted in proud Coast Guard auxiliary colors, serving alongside the vessels they once terrorized. Storm's Market became more than just a gathering place. It was a symbol of how communities could heal and grow stronger together. The Veterans Wall, with David Harrison's photo at its center, reminded visitors that every soul deserved a chance at redemption. "You know what I've learned?" Harrison told a group of young sailors one morning at Storm's counter. "True strength isn't about power over others, it's about the power to lift them up." Storm's compass remained on display, its inscription catching the morning light. "Through storms and battles, you always find true north." But now it guided more than just sailors. It guided lost souls back to honor and purpose. The harbor waters reflected not just boats and sky, but the spirit of transformation. Where fear once ruled, respect now governed. Where threats once echoed, laughter now rang out. The story of Seavale Harbor became a testament to the power of redemption, proof that even the darkest waters could carry ships home to light. As Storm locked up one evening watching Harrison teaching navigation to a group of young sailors, he smiled, knowing that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating enemies, but from turning them into family. The seas would bring new challenges, new storms to weather. But Seavale Harbor stood ready, its community bound together by something stronger than fear. The understanding that true strength lies not in the power to destroy, but in the courage to rebuild, to forgive, and to transform. Thank you for joining us for this incredible story of redemption and strength. If you believe in the power of second chances and want to see more stories that remind us of the good in humanity, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our community. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know where you're watching from. We've got another powerful story coming tomorrow that you won't want to miss. Until then, remember, true strength isn't about making others fear you, it's about lifting them up.